The silver trailers were everywhere. Interstate 81 through the Shenandoah Valley, up and down the East Coast. A plain steel box, two letters on the side, an S and a T. And then, inside a single summer, they were gone. Smith's transfer didn't start as a giant. It started in 1930 in Staunton, Virginia, in the heart of the Shenandoah Valley, and it started with cattle. Two brothers, a truck, and a route through farm country, hauling livestock to market for the men who couldn't get it there themselves. That's the whole origin. No grand plan, no investors, just cows that needed to move from a pasture to a stockyard. By the end of the 1970s, that cattle hauler was the largest truck line in the state of Virginia and the eighth largest in the entire country. The year before, it had booked $250 million in sales. The silver rigs weren't a regional curiosity anymore. They were a coast-reaching freight network with terminals scattered across the map. So how does a company that started by moving cows outgrow almost every trucking company in America? The answer is the freight nobody else wanted. Smith's built its fortune on what the old railroad men called less-than-carload shipments. Small loads, the trucking cousin of what the industry would later call LTL, less-than-truckload. Not one customer filling one trailer with one product bound for one place. Instead, dozens of little shipments from dozens of shippers, everyone going somewhere different, all riding in the same truck. It is the most miserable freight in the business to move. Every shipment has to be picked up in a city, hauled to a terminal, unloaded onto a dock, sorted by destination, reloaded onto a different truck, line hauled across the map, and then broken down a second time at the far end before a single box ever reaches the customer's door. It's a business of forklifts and clipboards and men working a freight dock at 3 in the morning. That misery was the moat. Long-haul truckload work, one shipper, one trailer, one destination, was simple. And because it was simple, everybody chased it. The small shipment business needed a web of terminals, an army of dock workers, and drivers who knew 100 delivery stops by heart. Building a network like that took decades. Once you had it, nobody could take it from you without spending 20 years and a fortune to match it. Which is exactly why, in 1979, Smith's caught the eye of a buyer that had no business owning a trucking company. ARA Services was a Philadelphia services conglomerate. It ran hospital cafeterias, it ran nursing homes, it ran daycare centers, school buses, and uniform rentals. It was, in plain terms, a company built on feeding people and cleaning up after them, and it wanted a truck line. ARA had studied several carriers before it approached Smith's, and in a stock deal worth about $84 million, it took over the silver fleet. On paper, the fit made no sense. Underneath, it was cold and specific. ARA's entire model was managing operations with large numbers of below-average wage workers who handled cash and goods far from any head office, cafeteria lines, bus routes, loading docks. To the men in Philadelphia, a trucking terminal wasn't so different from a hospital kitchen. A lot of low-margin labor that needed to be squeezed. That company, by the way, is still around today. You know it now as Aramark. So one of the largest trucking companies in America was suddenly owned by the people who ran your kid's school cafeteria. And they bought it at the worst possible moment in the history of the industry. On July 1, 1980, President Carter signed the Motor Carrier Act. Most people remember deregulation as simply more competition. More trucks, lower prices, a free-for-all on the highway. That part is true. Between 1980 and 1990, the number of authorized carriers doubled from fewer than 20,000 to more than 40,000. But the raw competition wasn't the real damage. The real damage hit something you couldn't see on the road at all. Before deregulation, the single most valuable thing a trucking company owned wasn't its trucks. It was paper. Specifically, its route authority, A grant from the Interstate Commerce Commission giving that carrier the legal right to haul freight on specific lanes. If Smiths held the authority to run a given lane, a competitor generally couldn't touch that freight without its own grant from the ICC. Shippers would open a directory, Leonard's Guide was one of them, and look up which carriers were even allowed to deliver to a given town. That government-issued map of routes was the crown jewel. It was worth more than the rolling stock in the yard. The Motor Carrier Act gutted that value in a few short years. Lanes that had been locked up for decades were suddenly open to almost anyone with a truck and a bank loan. The route authority Smiths had spent a lifetime accumulating, that entire competitive advantage, turned into a stack of paper worth almost nothing. And the flood of new non-union carriers drove rates straight into the floor. LTL prices fell 10 to 20%, and some shippers reported drops as steep as 40%. For the shipping public, it was a bonanza. Freight got cheaper and service got sharper. For an old, unionized, terminal-heavy carrier like Smith's, it was a slow execution. The company's two greatest strengths, its route map and its trained union workforce, became its two heaviest liabilities, almost the instant the ink dried on that law. Smith's didn't get outcompeted. Its entire reason for existing got legislated out from under it. ARA held on for a few more years, watching the asset it had bought at the top of the market bleed value, and then in 1987, it did what conglomerates do with a problem they don't understand. It sold. The buyer was a company called American Carriers, out of Overland Park, Kansas, an LTL operator with a tangled corporate history of its own. The trade press ran the headline flat and plain: American Carriers will buy Smith's transfer from ARA. On the surface, it looked like a rescue. One trucking company taking in another, keeping the silver trailers rolling. Here's what the headline didn't say. American Carriers was already wobbling. It was another deregulation casualty, another legacy carrier fighting the same losing war against cheaper, leaner competition. This wasn't a strong company absorbing a weak one. It was two wounded carriers roped together and pushed into deep water. They went down almost immediately. Right after the acquisition, American Carriers began shutting Smith's terminals, the very network that had taken half a century to build, going dark in a matter of months. Within a year, the group's main subsidiaries collapsed. American Freight System filed for Chapter 11 on August 16, 1988, and Smith's transfer went down in the same Kansas bankruptcy. For the drivers and the dockmen, the news came the way it always does: a padlock on a gate they'd pulled into for years, a dispatcher who stopped answering, somebody's freight sitting in a yard with nowhere to go. 58 years after two brothers started hauling cattle out of Staunton, the silver trailers came off the road for good. That should have been the end. The company was dead. The terminals were empty. The drivers were scattered. But the story doesn't stop at the funeral, because the corpse got back up and started suing people. When a carrier goes bankrupt, a trustee takes over the estate with one job: recover every dollar owed. And the estate found dollars in a strange place: Smith's own former customers. Under a rule called the filed rate doctrine, a trucking company was legally required to bill the exact rate it had on file with the Interstate Commerce Commission. No more, no less. But out in the real world, carriers had been quietly cutting deals for years, handing good customers a discount below the official rate to keep the business. Every one of those discounts was, on paper, a violation. So the trustee combed through years of old shipping records, found every load where a customer had been charged less than the filed rate, and sued them for the difference, money those customers had already paid in full at the price they'd been promised. The bankruptcy estate pursued 61 of these cases against former shippers, and it wasn't alone. Dozens of bankrupt carriers were chasing the same claims, and the backlash grew so loud that Congress finally stepped in and passed the Negotiated Rates Act of 1993 to rein the whole thing in. So the last thing Smith's transfer ever did, years after it had been reduced to a bankruptcy file in a Kansas courthouse, was reach back through its own paperwork and take one last swing at the customers who had kept it alive.